just to be respectful of everybody's time, we're just going to go ahead and get started. So welcome everybody to the Lunch and Learn on product development and market launches. Super excited to hear from the panel today. And just in a minute, they'll introduce themselves. Just as just to let y'all know, this webinar is being recorded. So I know there were a couple of people who sent me messages earlier this morning saying they weren't able to make it. So you'll be able to find the recording of the webinar later on the TIE Oregon website. So before we get started, I just wanted to thank our sponsor, Buckhalter, for sponsoring these webinars all year long. And I would also like to recognize a number of organizations that support the Venture Catalyst work overall, and that's Washington County, City of Hillsborough, City of Forest Grove, Oregon Community Foundation, and TIE Oregon. And on the next slide, Carrie, if you can advance. Thanks. Okay, so for those of you who don't know me, I'm Laura Kubitschek. I'm the Venture Catalyst for Washington County, and super happy to have all of you on this webinar this morning. If you need to reach out to me, I've included my email. It's just laura@venturecatalyst.biz. And if you're not familiar with the Venture Catalyst model, just real quick. So basically what I do is I meet one-on-one with entrepreneurs. I'll talk to you about your business plan. I'll provide some coaching and mentoring, but I'm also a connector. So I'll connect you to people with industry experience, functional experience, and when you're ready, I also know the folks that have the financial capital to help you grow. And I'm happy to provide those introductions, but also help you with your pitches before that's even done. So, so that in a nutshell is what I do. And I'd be happy to talk to any and all of you that are on this webinar today. And with that, I am going to pass it over to Ernie Boetsma, who is our moderator for today.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Lunch and Learn. We've got a great program today on product development, and we'll see some of the differences between physical products and software product launches and builds. We've got two great speakers today, and well, I guess before we get started, I'll tell you just a little bit about Buckhalter. So I'm a shareholder with the Buckhalter law firm. Buckhalter is a law firm on the West Coast. We have a practice that encompasses representing entrepreneurs and investors from formation of companies, fundraising, various types of investments, through all the way up through sale of the company. And I personally have been working here in the Portland market and all along the West Coast for the last 30 years, working with these groups. And I love working with entrepreneurs. Well, now we're going to turn it over. We're going to have two esteemed gentlemen. Julian Dunn is joining us, and Doug Porter, and they each have much experience in their product development backgrounds. And I'm going to let them introduce themselves and then give a little bit of introductory talk. And then as we move into the discussion today, my job will be to help facilitate any of the questions that we're trying to get resolved and on the table, and make sure that we flow along this afternoon. If anyone has questions, I think, are we sending those to you, Laura, or should we?
They can just, yeah, I forgot to mention that. Thanks, Ernie. Yes, just put your questions in the chat room and I'll keep track of them all. But I think Julian and Doug, excuse me, we'll both say that they'd love this to be an interactive session. So feel free to post those questions and I'll try to interject them as we go along. So thanks, Ernie.
Right. Well, thank you. And why don't we move first to Julian, since you're just left closer to me on my screen than Doug, but no particular order. But Julian, why don't you take it over? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Ernie. And thanks, Laura and the TIE Oregon for having me today. So my name is Julian Dunn. I currently work as a director of product marketing for PagerDuty, which is a software company that's actually based out of San Francisco, but I work up here in Portland. And I would characterize myself as a generalist. I didn't plan on getting into marketing when I first started my career. over 20 years ago. Actually, I started out more on the hardware side as a hardware engineer, and then I became a software engineer and moved into operations, and then became a product manager for some period of time, and then eventually found my way into product marketing. So I have a lot of experience with developing products, bringing them to market, validating value propositions with customers. I've worked at companies that are as small as, well, probably like 2 or 3 folks, maybe where some of you folks are at, all the way up to larger companies. The company I work for now is about 1,200 people. So, I understand what it's like to have resources constrained. And even when you're a big company, you still want to make sure that you're still abiding by those good practices and principles of minimal viable product and this kind of a thing. So you're wasting company resources. So I do help coach a lot of folks around product development, how to be economical with your resources, how to define value propositions, and use some of the frameworks out there, working with our product management team to go and do that. And then in terms of you folks, I also advise organizations and companies and entrepreneurs and things like that in this manner. So if you're looking to just bounce some ideas off me, feel free to get in touch. But that's sort of what I do, and again, I have a lot of experience in a lot of different areas. So that's I'm hoping to have a great conversation with you folks today.
Thank you, Julian. Doug? Oh, you're on mute, Doug.
There we go. I'm Doug Porter. We're located in Washington County, also in Wilsonville. And thanks again to Ty and Laura for putting this all together for us. My background is a design engineer, and we currently serve anywhere from 100 to 200 companies per year in the product development realm as a contract engineering house where we propel commercially successful products to market. We do this specifically just for hard durable goods, though we bridge medical, industrial, consumer, and military products. I've been doing this more years than I'd like to admit. One of the things that we do that's unique, and the reason that Laura asked me to come, is we have our own incubator. And we've done 6 startups of our own in various industries. So we've learned firsthand a lot of the challenges that entrepreneurs and small angel and venture funded groups have to get over to get a product to market. So we've got examples of things that have worked well and things that have been absolute catastrophes. So I look forward to hearing all of your questions. And if we can certainly help you in the future, or if you have an idea that you think might be good for our incubator, look me up in Wilsonville. I'm sure Laura can provide the information.
Thank you, Doug. Well, I think the first thing that I'd like to do is start to delve into this product development process. Again, that's what we're going to be speaking about today, is the process and how we go through it. But I think a lot of our audience is comprised of entrepreneurs and early stage folks. So maybe the best place to start is, let's start at the beginning. When someone comes up with an idea for a new product, either software or hardware, how do they get started? What should they be thinking about early in the process? And well, I'll kick that over to you, Julian, first, and then Doug, maybe you can follow up on that same question.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Ernie. What I would say is it's probably more important to think about whether or not you have a good definition of the problem, right? A lot of us like to, and especially if we're domain experts, right? If we're engineers or we understand that domain, let's start with, oh, we have a great idea and this is what that product is going to look like. And what I find more often than not is like the harder part is like, what is actually the problem that it's going to solve and for who, right? So in product marketing, we have what's called a classical positioning statement, which is like, this product is intended to do this job, to solve this problem for this persona, so that they can do something else with their lives, right? So that they can, save time or improve efficiency or whatever. And the definition of the problem actually is the harder part. And how are you going to find out whether or not your problem statement is cogent and is actually solving something that people are willing to pay money for? Is you need to actually get out there and get the streets, right? And to use your network and to talk to folks, to talk to who you think your target population is, and start validating that problem statement, right? Not necessarily hitting them with what your solution is and telling them about all the gears and whiz bang widgets and things like that, but really getting to the nut of what is it a valuable enough problem? Is it painful enough for them to actually want to solve it by purchasing something, right? Because people do have a lot of problems, but sometimes it doesn't rise to that level of pain for you to actually go and invest in paying for that product, right? And so you want to get this feedback, in my view, as early as you can. And this talking to people is cheap, right? It doesn't cost any money. Maybe a cup of coffee that you have to buy them, or at least in the pre-COVID time, you can kind of do that, right? But it's better to do that and to speak to a lot of those folks and validate, do you really have that solid concept before you actually do any kind of like R&D and investment, especially when you're in hard goods or something, right? Like Doug is in, right? Where the capital expenditures can be very high. You want to nail this part of your value proposition as soon as possible. And the only way you're going to go and do that is by talking to folks. So that would be kind of what, the advice that I give a lot of folks in terms of how they're starting out, and when they have an idea that they think has some legs. It's like, let's start there and define the problem.
Thanks, Julian. Doug, further thoughts on kind of this beginning part of this process?
I think Julian hit the nail on the head that over time we've found that is probably the single biggest thing that has tripped people up, is they've designed things in a vacuum. Either because they're not sales and marketing people, maybe they're technical, or in the medical profession, a lot of times it's doctors where they think they have a good idea, but they don't go out and validate that value proposition. And really, if you can't articulate that in 20 or 30 seconds in an elevator, and a potential investor or user doesn't look at you and go, hey, I get it, that's obvious enough, that's better than how I'm currently solving my problem. How do I get in on this thing? If you really don't get that response, you should really question whether the idea is good to begin with. The next thing, and we see like Stanford studies this quite a bit, is they teach product development down there, and they've really simplified evaluating ideas down into 3 things nowadays. And the first one is the opportunity real? And that's kind of what they're asking. Is there really a problem to be solved with this device? And the next step is they say, is it worth it? Well, how many people are going to buy this? If there's only 10,000 potential customers in the United States, you can't afford probably to go out and reach those guys and have a viable business, especially one that anybody wants to invest in. And then lastly is, if we do go for it, can we win it? And so you really have to ask yourself, are we well positioned to be able to tackle this industry with competition? Do we have the money? Do we have the access to the sales and marketing channels and those thought leaders that we're going to need for testimonials to promote this? So if you really kind of try to get at those 3 tenets, is, is it worth it? Can we win it? And I'd like people to kind of start there and finally make sure somebody hasn't already done it, that you're not aware of it. Some people will try to get into industries they're not familiar with, and there's somebody on the other side of the world or the side of the country that's already doing it, or might have patent protection blocking you out. So you really need to check all that before you start going down that road.
So when you start these interviews to collect this data and try to define the problem, how do you find these people, and who should you be talking to? Maybe I'll start with you, Doug, and then we'll go back to Julian.
We encourage people to map out their ecosystem. So simply sit down with 8.5 by 11 piece of paper and block diagram out. First of all, who is the decision maker that's going to be making the purchase? Put them at the center of your piece of paper with a block. Really identify who that is. Sometimes this will be a little bit complex, that you need to go back and segment that group to find out who you're going to tackle first. But then start drawing blocks in from the side. Who are your competitors? Who are the influencers in that market, either positive or negative? You can have folks that are social media icons that might pan you, that might be a danger to you. But hopefully there's people out there that are going to be able to help you along the way. In the medical world, we're looking for those testimonial, prominent doctors nationwide that get up and they publish papers and they get up and speak at their national committee meetings. Map out that ecosystem. Once you do that, get a smattering of people you're going to go after, interview those people, put that together. And I can just about guarantee you that your original hypothesis you had for what that solution is your product was going to do is going to change. And if you do that and learn that early enough, you save tons of time, tons of money. In the worst case, you find out you don't really have a good product idea or a good solution for the market, and then you move on to the next idea. But you saved yourself 2 years of your life.
Julie?
Yeah, Doug, I can't emphasize that enough, right? It's like, you know, one kind of cardinal sin that I see sometimes when working with entrepreneurs is like the marriage of your personal identity with your idea. That, you know, you can't think about it in that way if you're going to be a successful entrepreneur, right? You are not your idea. Your idea is a hypothesis. You want to figure out if that idea is valuable, if people are willing to pay for it, right? But you should be, you know, you want to have some distance from that, right? Actually, I went to journalism school for my graduate degree, and they used to tell us it's an ugly metaphor, right? But they used to say, you got to kill your babies sometimes, right? What they mean is your copy, you can't be too tied to the paragraphs that you're writing, right? Because it could be very unclear and you could be like, that's the greatest sentence I ever crafted, right? But if your editor is saying that's actually doesn't make any sense and doesn't fit the storyline, like it's not a reflection on you. Your copy is not you, right? And so the same thing with your ideas are not you. The other thing I would say with respect to how do you find folks to be able to go and validate your ideas, well, and I think it depends a lot on the nature of the industry that you're in. In software, and especially in B2C software, it's often easier to find people that you can run things by, right? So imagine you were the entrepreneur that was like inventing Instagram or something. It's a lot easier to go and find 5 people in a coffee shop and run that idea by than maybe like a medical device or something like that, where, you know, you're really selling to doctors and things like that, right? So just think about tuning who you're talking to by virtue of the channel and the population that you're trying to sell into. But even still what I would say is, even for what I do, which is now enterprise software, kind of B2B, sometimes you don't necessarily need to get to the decision maker. It's pretty hard to get to a CIO or CTO to interview them, right? But for software products specifically, sometimes you can think about also talking to users too, right? In terms of, again, back to validating, is there a real problem? Because at least in enterprise software, there's sort of 2 sales motions. You have a top-down sales motion, but often nowadays, especially with cloud services and things like this, right, there's a bottoms-up motion where a lot of the purchases are driven by users as well. And users, you can generally get, there's a much larger population of them. And I think a lot of what you do, or a lot of what I see successful entrepreneurs doing, is spending just a lot of time on that hustle, if you will, right? Just the outreach and cold calling people and the reaching out on LinkedIn and things like that, and tapping your network. A lot of that just shoe leather, kind of finding those individuals, anybody that will give you a time of day to go and validate or invalidate your ideas, right? Just, you know, think out of the box and don't be afraid to kind of put yourself out there. And also, as I was saying before, when people say, no, that's not a valuable idea, it's not a reflection on you. That's input, that's good data, right? You don't want to just make a decision off one data point. You want to aggregate that, but you don't want to take negative feedback as, oh, I'm a bad entrepreneur or whatever. That helps you, right? To Doug's point, that saves you potentially 2 years of product development. If you get enough no's, you know where to divert your energy, where maybe there is more of a better value proposition.
So that's fascinating. So if I've talked to all these people and I'm an entrepreneur and I've validated the fact that there is a problem and I've got an idea for a solution, what if I don't necessarily have the domain experience to develop the software or to develop the product? How do I get started then? What's that next step start to look like? Maybe we'll start with you, Julian, then back to Doug.
Yeah, and I will say that in software, it is a little bit easier sometimes to do this, right? But maybe there's also a projection on this into what Doug does in hardware and things like this. In software, even if you're not a domain expert necessarily with maybe software engineering and things like that, I think what you're kind of asking also is like, when do you hire your first engineer? And I would say probably not right away. You know, even if you're developing the shape of your concept, your problem is well defined, you kind of know what the solution looks like, you should think about using, and there's a lot of these great tools out there for even non-professionals. This didn't exist, by the way, 20, 25 years ago when I was starting out in the industry, but just things that allow you to prototype and to sketch things out, right? Effectively like a back of the napkin kind of simulation. And, you know, the Balsamiq and tools like that allow you to just, even as a person that's, you know, not non-technical, doesn't know how to program, how do you put the shape of the product in front of them, right? The visual, because the visual, you know, like a picture's worth 1,000 words. And also, like, what does interacting with the product, even if it's sort of in a rough form, what would that sort of look like, right? Like, what would clicking on this button do? And these are all kinds of things, at least in software, that you can kind of prototype out. And then even when you kind of get to the next stage, well, let me tell you a story, right? A lot of I lived in New York for 7 years. There are a lot of successful startup founders in New York that actually were not technical and eventually built software businesses, but you would think that they would have started by hiring programmers like 6 months in. And in point of fact, many of them didn't, right? I don't know how many of you are familiar with the company Rent the Runway. You know, it's the company that allows you to like rent the expensive gowns or formal wear and things like, again, it's pre-COVID era, right? But to go to a formal event and things like that. And they actually started out with 2 non-technical founders, and they actually just built their prototype on WordPress, just to validate the concept of actually, to simulate what that user experience would look like, and then putting it in the market and seeing if they got any traction, right? So that's another thing you can do. One other tip I'll give you is also like to see if your value proposition actually has legs, right? That solution. You can also just put up a marketing page and mock up screenshots, right? Even hiring a graphic designer is cheaper than a hiring programmer, right? Putting up fake screenshots or something and what we call false doors in software, and just basically being like, this is the shape of the product, and then promoting it and see if anybody clicks on, buy now or whatever. And behind that buy now, it's like, sign up for our waiting list or whatever, we're developing the product. So you can test the market really, really cheaply with these sort of like signal generation approaches, just to see if you're getting some hooks and some bites, right? And to see if that solution is actually valuable in meeting and solving the problem that you're claiming to solve without even writing a line of code or hiring a software engineer. So that's probably where I would start.
Thanks, Julian. Doug? Further thoughts?
Yeah. Durable goods are, like Julian says, is a little bit more of a challenge depending on the scope of the product. If I've got a new airplane idea or a new artificial heart, that's going to be pretty expensive to get a minimum viable product out there and test. So those are much more difficult. You better have a lot deeper pockets to do it. Since the 2003 .com crash and the vacation from the VCs from pre-revenue companies, before companies are building a product, there ended up being a big hole out there, especially with the advent of what I call infinitely scalable type opportunities for venture capital firms to invest in. They don't go after hard durable goods like they used to. So a lot of the money kind of evaporated. And the expectation is a lot more risk needs to be taken out of product companies before you're going to get outside money to invest in something. And so we're seeing, over the last 15 years, where almost the minimum expectation is where the owners, the founders, put enough skin in the game that they may have tooled up pre-production or early production stuff to be able to get out there. So the barrier has gotten higher for durable goods because it's much easier to invest in a software company, and if it doesn't work out, doing a different one the next year, and you don't have a bunch of capital equipment sitting out there. So I try to set the expectation with folks, when they're wanting to decide what path to go down, is how far they think they need to do it before they get outside investment or they think they're going to do an exit. And as a result, we're seeing probably an increase in the amount of customers that opt to go down the licensing path, where they want to just take a product, take enough risk out of it that they can demonstrate to a potential licensee that they're going to be able to produce it for the cost of goods sold that they're predicting, and that they've tested it and there's people actually going to buy it. So they're near requiring venture capital fund de-risking, I would say. So things definitely have changed, especially with the internet and all these social media type companies. A lot of the money flows that way. Even in medical devices, a lot of the medical record history stuff, the software related stuff, sucks up a lot of the medical investors that would have gone to devices in years past. And I think the final trend that we're seeing is the consolidation of some industries that we hadn't seen before, like medical, these big buying groups like Kaiser and things like that. They now are becoming hyper price sensitive. And so to get a new product in there where you could introduce it to a chief thought leader at a single hospital, those days are starting to go away. And you're having to focus on products that are just contributing to the bottom line. So a lot of interesting trends out there, but entrepreneurial groups need to be aware of them.
Thank you, Doug. You mentioned the minimum viable product. Again, that's a term we hear a lot, both in software and in hard goods. How does the entrepreneur define what is their minimum viable product? And I hear about feature creep that occurs in software. I'm sure that occurs in hard goods as well. I mean, how do you make that decision, and then how do you limit it to the right features to get this minimum product out there? Doug, you want to start with that, and then we'll go back to Julian?
What we try to direct customers to is, with our first meetings with them, is to sit down there and essentially extract answers from them and to develop what we call a marketing spec, which is a qualitative objective of the new durable good. So for example, I want something to be lightweight, and I want it to be bright colored, and I want it to fit most people. Those are very qualitative objectives, but my engineering team can't go out and build anything to that. But I kind of get an essence of what they want, and hopefully they've extracted that from that primary research from the marketplace. You know, when they're out doing those interviews with those end consumers, they're not going to tell them I want a Pantone R32 red color. They're going to tell them I wanted a pretty red. And so once we can extract that from the customer into must-have and nice-to-have features, then our technical team gets involved and we write a technical specification, which is in a sense an answer of how we're going to achieve that in measurable quantities. And as I tell them, if I've done a good job of extracting that from you, when I give you your minimum viable product or that first prototype and I pop it on the desk and I pull up that specification, anybody who reads that spec can look at that product sitting on the table and say, well, it's not lightweight. I said it's going to be less than 3 pounds. Put it on a scale. Is it or isn't? Did I meet that objective? You know, here's a color spectrometer. Is it that red color that we promised? And so if you systematically go through there, what you'll find is those documents become a very powerful, non-confrontational negotiation tool between all the personalities that are typically involved. And in the bigger entities that we work with, this can be very confrontational between a marketing team, who generally very qualitative thinkers, more abstract, compared to with the real technical thinkers on their engineering team. And so these documents allow them to address the document, and we can battle over different line items on it rather than battle with each other. So it becomes a very effective negotiation tool, and it allows people to constructively decide how we're going to make compromises. Because ultimately I pop this on the desk, everybody goes, hey, it works great except for one thing. And I said, what's that? Well, it's going to cost us $300 to make it, and we need to be at $78. And I said, well, you wanted it to be super strong and invisible. Can I get rid of one of those? And they say, yeah, well, maybe it doesn't need to be invisible. Okay, now we can make it for $78 and everybody's happy and on the same page. So that's the technique we use with folks.
Thank you, Doug. Julian, differences in software, or is it similar process?
I think it's similar. We maybe use different terminology. And what I will also say is, Doug, I absolutely agree, right? The surest way to kill a product, you know, in its infancy is to dogpile too many requirements on there. Many of them are conflicting, right? There's an old story about the HP Kitty Hawk hard drive in the 80s, right? Which was like, they wanted it to be small, they wanted it to be fast, they wanted it to be cheap. And a lot of those things are in conflict with one another, and sure way to make sure that you don't ship anything is to try and satisfy everything as a first class requirement out the door. Now, Doug, you mentioned that you use, you know, requirements documents and things like this. I mean, in essence, the techniques may be different. We use different terms and different ways of going about it. We use terms like story mapping and things like that. Software is much less about written requirements these days, and maybe that's because there's maybe less negotiation with external entities around this. But the through line of that is really, really similar to what you're talking about, right? And when I say through line, what I really mean is, like, what is the core job to be done in the product, right? And is there a story that this minimal viable product actually solves, right? Because one of the common problems that happens in software, because like everything's cheap, quote unquote, to develop software. So you often have engineers going way too deep down one particular angle of a particular piece of software, but the thing doesn't do anything once it's shipped, right? It doesn't accomplish at least one key job to be done that the buyer is going to find valuable and is going to be able to accomplish something, derive value from, right? So an example is a piece of software to which like the login screen and the authentication is all gold plated, but then you log in and you can't actually do anything, right? Well, what use is that? That's not really a minimal viable product. That's just, one gold plated. It's like creating a car that has like an amazing engine, right? But there's actually no seats and no steering, and you can't actually go anywhere, right? So if you can't use that car to actually go someplace, and who cares if it's got the best engine technology in it, right? So those are the kinds of things that we try to avoid in software, and we use tactics like, again, you have all these requirements, right? Just like as Doug was saying, maybe some of them are conflicting requirements. A lot of them is just, hey, let's get everybody together, let's write them down. And then you can, again, a lot of you are in a pre-COVID time, but there's also tools now online for you to be able to do this. So let's figure out how we arrange those stories, right? Which you can just write on Post-its or whatever, or virtual Post-its. And how can you arrange this in a narrative that's like a user journey to get somebody from when they first start using the product to actually achieving something, right? And once you put all that stuff up in kind of a narrative, then you start to be able to say, do we really need to ship every single one of these requirements in order to get to that objective that they're trying to achieve? And more often than not, you don't, right? And so then you start being able to visually say, I have all this stuff. Now I can move this down to future iterations and future releases, assuming that my first MVP's value proposition was satisfied and that we actually have a end-to-end job that we're actually solving for and a customer is finding value. And the good thing about doing it this way is you're not overbuilding too, right? Because a lot of that stuff you created, below the line, when you actually take that MVP out and talk to customers, invariably you're going to find that some of the things that you started investing in were not useful, right? They wanted to see more or less. They managed to achieve their objective, but the shape of the product is totally different. So a lot of the stuff below the line that you talk about with your initial team, your initial engineering team, you may never actually get around to building ever, right? It could just end up on the cutting room floor. And that's really the objective of doing that MVP, right? So you're not wasting time doing all this other stuff that really probably didn't need to be built to deliver value, right? So that's kind of how we go about it in software, but it's got heritage and lineage to sort of what Doug's talking about too.
So it's really starting to connect that original problem with, again, are you solving that problem in some simple way, or at least direct way that you've accomplished the initial work? Mm-hmm. Oh, that's interesting. So when you're working with these entrepreneurs and you're trying to develop this new software, how do they collaborate with you? And I'll go to you, Doug, next. So we'll start with Julian. So how do the entrepreneurs work and collaborate with the team that's building the software or building the product?
Well, with specific to an engineering team, these days, most organizations are using agile practices, agile software engineering practices, which really encapsulate what I'm talking about with respect to like mapping out this overall flow, right? And the objective is to get the engineering team to not be so divorced from the customer, especially in the early stages of validating your idea, and be able to be responsive to change that might happen, right? You don't even know if this idea is, you have a hypothesis, you think that this idea is going to be valuable. You don't know for certain, right? And you need that engineering team to be very adaptable and flexible to be able to change, right? So the idea is to not show up with too many requirements and a long backlog or list of things to go and do, but to keep the scoping of the near term of what they're building within the next couple of weeks or something. That stuff has got to be pretty high resolution, right? Because they've got to actually start developing that right away. But all the other stuff, right? You don't want to plan too far ahead, because as I'm saying, things are going to change drastically. Your hypotheses are going to be invalidated. So what we typically use is agile practices, and agile practices are around breaking down the work into things like relatively common sizes of stories, if you will, or work that have a clear acceptance criteria and an outcome associated with them. And the idea to keep those work units relatively relatively consistent is that you kind of know what the throughput of the team is going to be, right? And so you kind of know how much can I expect from my engineering team, how quickly can I get things done, right? Get features shipped. So you have some predictability in your business, which is like a really important muscle to develop, especially once you start getting some traction with your product and you start growing, right? You're going to have lots of customers. Hopefully you have lots of customers who show up, well, I want this and I want that, right? So it helps you to prioritize and that the breaking down of work and the scheduling and the delivery, those are the most important things that I, as a product manager, as a former product manager, spend most of my time working with engineering on, right? Getting them to decompose work and be able to ship on time.
So Julian, we have a question that's popped up from Heather, and then there's another one that I'll have Doug respond to when he talks. But from Heather, she's wondering, can you speak to launching, managing, and knowing when to wrap up a beta version window, especially if the beta will be free and the official version will not?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, it depends on a lot of things. Let me tell you what it depends on, because nobody likes that economics answer, right? Oh, it depends. Of course, it depends, right? I would say that, especially in software, once you beta, what I would say is that beta is a signal which you can take positively or negatively. Your customers will interpret positively or negatively, and that can accrete to your benefit or not, right? If you have beta on there for an extended period of time or for some portion of time, what you're signaling to the market is, hey, early adopters, come on in, right? I'm not totally sure about this product and whether or not it meets whether or not it's delivering value completely to you. I'm not totally sure if there's rough edges yet, but hey, if you're the type of person that's like, if you were the first person to go and buy a Tesla when it first came out, if you self-identify with that crowd, then come on in, right? And sometimes those populations can be really good to get a lot of those folks, right? And so if your product is kind of like that, then you don't want to cut off that beta too early, right? Because actually that first set of Tesla owners, if you will, if you got to think about Elon Musk, right? He got enough of them to create this vibrant community and kind of a network effect and friends telling each other about how awesome this thing was. And oh yeah, it's a little unfinished and it's a little rough around the edges here, but that's okay, right? We identify as this kind of community, this beta community or whatever, and that can actually create a lot of value to your organization. Now, the flip side of it is, and again, depends on who you're selling your product to, right? It depends on who the ultimate buyer is. And I think Google kind of made this mistake early in the day with Gmail and things like that, where the joke was Gmail was beta for like 10 years, right? And the problem with that is it signaled to the enterprise buyer that the product wasn't ready, right? And so it prolonged the ability of Microsoft Exchange and Outlook and all these sort of enterprise products from Microsoft. And they could basically go in there and say, the Gmail thing isn't for you as the enterprise, right? It's you just keep using our product because that Gmail thing has been beta forever, right? They're never going to finish it, this kind of thing, right? So again, it depends who your population is, right? And I sort of articulate B2C versus B2B. And is there a network effect that's sort of inherent in the product that you can exploit before you actually kind of move from that beta to a maybe generally available life cycle stage?
I'm going to be going into a 1 o'clock.
Right. There's somebody that's not muted, so I'm going to pop in. I know that some folks have to multitask, but okay, appreciate it. So Doug, so one of the questions that's popped up here is just, around this MVP and creating a prototype. So what are the options to creating a durable hard good prototype without expense? And sometimes because entrepreneurs, they're bootstrapping at the beginning, so they can't afford to buy a lot of equipment, but they want to get a prototype or some sort of MVP out there so they can at least test the market. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, there's multiple reasons to do prototyping. I think that hard durable goods, the project management is a simpler task than software in a lot of respects, because in software almost anything is possible, but we're limited by economic realities of tooling and what can be done physically. So we early on try to identify all the risk items, and there's going to be risk items from a marketing standpoint, regulatory and technical. So when we're looking at building prototypes, we ask ourselves why and what we're going to do and how many we need for each one of them. That's going to dictate the processes that are viable for that. So, an example would be, let's see, like a medical device. Maybe I don't want to be a medical device manufacturer, but I would like to license that technology to $1 billion Medtronics or something. But Medtronic, they've got a 5-year window that they're already planning what they're doing. To break into that new product development or to become an acquisition target, I got to take all the risk out for them. I got to show up with my patents filed or awarded, a functioning prototype with a costed bill of materials and a good value proposition. So in that case, the medical devices are normally fairly small. I can take advantage of 3D printing instead of injection molding, for example, to make 1 or 2 of these to show these guys from a marketing standpoint. Or maybe I need to do a small clinical study with 10 or 20 units instead of investing in a bunch of tooling. We see hybrids of that where there aren't cost-effective ways to make extrusions with a prototype material. It's actually cheaper to go out and buy a single cavity extrusion die and just run a few feet of stuff and make it that way. So every hard durable good is kind of a unique proposition that way. But as a rule, if you're approaching another company, outside investors besides friends and family, you need to show somebody that something that's takes the risk out of it in their mind, that it can be done, and that looks like it can be done for how many dollars you say it's going to be. Unless they're really closely known to you, is our experience is people aren't going to invest in something that hasn't been de-risked to that point. And there's no real one general silver bullet. You're going to spend money to make prototypes. Prototypes are expensive. 3D printing and those kind of things are making it cheaper, but they don't eliminate it by any means.
Great, thank you, Doug. We actually had an interesting question that might be, it's backing up a little bit in the process a bit, but it's a question from Dave Barkos that says that we consistently have prospective clients who come to us asking to build something that already exists in the market. Do you have tools or ways to help with the competitive research as the teams are starting to build this? And maybe we'll start with you, Doug, and then Julian, you can answer that question next. And then I think after that, I'd like to start moving into a launch of a product and a little bit about that. So start thinking about that. But Doug, this question on competitive research, what do you think?
That's a great question, and I have a fairly pat answer for companies nowadays that I find them in one of 2 camps. Oregon companies typically are on the smaller side when you look at them nationally, unless you're looking at the Nikes and the Intels. And they have an advantage that they're not aware of, but they also have a very critical flaw that a lot of them seem to suffer from, is a lot of these homegrown, especially where the founders are still around in the companies where they've developed a technology, built a company around it, and spent the last 7 to 20 years with a core product line that's predicated on technology. They were the ones who started that in their garage, and they have the perception that something new is going to have that same level of innovation, and they're going to have to come up with that new spark of an idea. But they've been away from the industry, and what allowed them to come up with that idea in the first place was they probably were working in that industry, saw that need where there was a value proposition, devised a solution. And now that they've been fighting fires for the last 7 to 20 years, managing employees, production lines, and suppliers, they're a little farther away from new tech and those problems. And the likelihood of them finding that spark again is almost nil. And so they get frustrated. They try to do their own product development and come up with something radically new, and they fail. And that's about the time when we normally see them come to us. And what I tell them is, I said, why are you here? And they said, well, we haven't come up with a new product. It was the 2008 collapse. Sales started to soften up. Our product became commoditized. Our margins are eroding. We want to grow. We don't know how, and now we feel like we're running out of time. And what do you want to do? We want to have come something radically new. And I said, why? Well, that's what we did before. what's the objective? What do your company want to do as a global objective of, well, we want to grow. Do you care if you grow by innovation, or do you just want to grow by sales volume? Oh, we'd love to just grow by sales volume. Well, then take advantage of what you have that is of more value than the day you started your business. And they say, what is that? And I said, well, it's that list of customers, distributors, suppliers, and retailers that buy your product that you've been evolving over the last 7 to 20 years. You did not have that list of names before. You did not have that industry access. I said, yeah, I probably can't help you if you are the largest company in the world in your space. Are you? And the CEO of Intel never asked me this, never get a meeting with him. So I'm typically dealing with customers that go, oh my God, no, we're like number 7, maybe in the country. We're number 2 in Oregon, or we're regionally. So, okay, if you're anybody except number 1 in your segment, and you're making a hard, durable good, and you already are selling these, nationally or internationally even, I said, let's sit down and make you a product that is going to attack the market share of number 1 and number 2 and number 3. You've got the advantage of going looking at what these guys have done, seeing what feature set that they put out there, like Julian said, that's not being used, not putting that in there so you can undercut them on price, figure out what doesn't work really well, make it work, function better. So you can have a superior product to show. And if you went to your existing supplier base or your retailers and your distributors right now, and you had a catalog which was closer to the size of your number 1 competitor with these fast follower products, would you think you'd be starting at 0 on your sales? They go, no, they'd probably buy a bunch here. And I said, I tell you what, I'll make you a deal. I said, get your CFO in here. I said, give me your catalog, give me the number 1 and number 2 guys' catalogs. Let me study it for a little bit. And if you guys will write up a contract where you will expend the same amount of sales and marketing dollars for one of the products I choose, I will design a new product. I will pay for all the engineering. I will pay for all the capital equipment tooling for that. And all I want is the profits for the next 5 years. After that, if there's any patents or tooling or drawings left over, it all reverts back to you guys. And so we'll look at that. The CFO will come in and we'll look at that real quickly, and we'll look at their product and they say, well, we're selling about 1.7 million of this product. Yeah, and if we did something with similar volumes, we should expect to see, after about 9 to 12 months, similar type volumes here. And then the CFO quickly grabs the CEO, typically, pulls him inside a room, and he goes, do you realize that guy is going to invest $300,000 and walk out of here with $4.7 million? And they walk back in there, and the CFO says, well, we're not going to do that. And I said, why not? You guys aren't doing it. And real quickly, they kind of change their understanding of how this works. And so Oregon is very, very well situated with companies like that to do that kind of analysis and kind of product development. You don't have to have, you just need to go out there and study your industry. Those value propositions are the easiest ones in the world to develop because they're proven. Your competitors did it for you. So easy stuff.
Thank you, Doug. Julian, thoughts on that competitive research, and then starting to think about launch topics, because we are getting closer to the top of the hour. So I want to make sure we keep this moving along. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just keep it brief. Doug, I think you captured most of what I was going to say, which is like what you're really talking about is like deep value capture versus value creation. I think what you got to ask yourself too as a company, right, is do you have good, I think what you were saying is like, do you have a good core competency around value creation, right? Are you well positioned to go and do that? Are you more of a value capture kind of organization? And assuming you have that core competency, then you start to think about some of these requests that come in for, people asking you to build something that already exists in the market. Then that's where you're really digging into, right, the differentiation, and not just like feature by feature differentiation. Like it's the why behind behind it, right? It's like what Steve Jobs used to say is like, look, if I had just built what my customers were asking me, I would have had a better, smartphone with the T9 texting and all this, right? So it's about digging into and asking, the 7 whys, or asking those customers, what is that you're looking to accomplish, right? By asking for these features that you can't get in the existing product that's on the market. And what is it that you're actually trying to achieve? And if you keep asking them more whys, right? Don't be annoying about it, right? Don't literally go and ask 7 whys, right? But what you're trying to get at the nut of is what's the problem? What's the unaddressed problem that they're not actually getting out of the existing solution? And then once you kind of know that, then you begin to ask yourself, okay, so is that something that we're willing to invest in to actually go and try to create some value out of, right? Rather than just capturing value by mimicking something, right? The more differentiation you can put in front of your customer could also open up other unaddressed markets that may not come from that initial customer that actually approached you, right? So those are kind of 2 of the top things that I would think about in terms of how you feel those requests, whether or not you should go forward.
Thank you, Julian. Well, let's switch over to launch. So, when you've got this product, you've been building it for a while, you're ready to launch. When do you know you're ready, and what is a successful launch look like? Or maybe what is a successful launch look like?
You want to start with me, Ernie?
Yeah, why don't you go ahead and start, Julian?
Yeah,
Sorry.
this one I think is where there's probably more difference between hard goods, soft goods. I would say. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe when Doug jumps in, maybe he can correct me. But the interesting thing about software is, like, especially for early companies, entrepreneurs, is sometimes it actually pays to not necessarily have a big splashy launch event, right? Because not only does it spend a lot of money, right, and especially if you're not totally sure, and you're not necessarily in a place where you need to. Maybe I'll say it differently. Software is infinitely adaptable, right? And so based on the feedback that you get from the market, you can actually relatively quickly, relatively to hard goods, change what it is that product shape is, right? And so what you actually see more and more of these days, especially in software, is less of a sort of monolithic, like, giant launch event, and more just, word of mouth and product hunt kind of posting, or just using social media and things like that, and getting the word out there, and kind of using an organic, right, customer acquisition model, because you're not totally sure about whether or not that value proposition is valid or not. And then once you have enough kind of the early adopters in there, and maybe you're actually starting to generate revenue from a few of them, then what you actually see is people, once you have some cash coming in, right, then what you see is people engaging in more realistic kind of, like, bigger kind of launch events. Now, what I will say is, like, again, it depends a lot on the shape of your product too, right? And depends a lot on your competitors and things like that. And if it is something that if you're entering a really competitive market, that you have something that's really, you think is you're sure it's gonna blow people away, right? It's gonna be highly differentiated from the other folks, and you've worked on it for 2 years and kind of stealth, then sometimes at that point, what I'll see is like a big launch event, with some, industry speakers and things like that, and that sort of a thing. So again, it depends on the nature of the product and also the competitive forces in the industry that you're in.
Julian, Doug, would you like to comment on kind of what launch looks like for a durable good?
Well, it depends on the industry. Obviously, if I'm making an artificial heart, the testing that needs to be done is going to be a lot more than if I was making a decorative cell phone case. And so it's very varied, and you need to right size the testing you do internally before you're ready to turn that loose. And to be successful, the company needs to have a realistic time frame to allow everybody to do the due diligence, to make sure that right size testing and that evolution is done, because it's very easy to poison a brand if you go too early. We see a lot of the Kickstarter type companies. That's one of the biggest things they suffer from, is they get all this money and they have no idea how to manufacture, and they have a great idea, but they put it out there, and then social media pans them and kills the company. So every one of those circumstances is different, but you want to make sure you've got a good plan up front to kind of right size it. And that doesn't even talk about warranty exposure and things like that.
looks like we have a couple more minutes. If you guys each have some thoughts, maybe on some maybe mistakes or a quick story on a failed launch, and then I think we can wrap it up.
I've got lots of those.
Yeah, me too.
Okay, yeah.
We did one of the companies that we incubated here the last few years was called L-Quick. And we had a small group approach us that had insider information for the building products industry to develop something that is going to apply sheetrock mud to the corner beads for sheetrock in commercial buildings. And they were part of actually a national company and had access into their training facilities. They were part of the crews that actually did this. And we internally developed a product. We tested it. It worked fantastic, wrapped a company up around it, and got out there and found out that the sheetrock industry themselves started to vertically integrate into those corner beading things, came up with a new technology, a new product that made it virtually obsolete. So though there was an opportunity for all these national companies to use the other product, it died within 24 months. So that primary research, knowing the market really well, we didn't ourselves do a good job of that and lost a lot of money in the process. But I get to tell the story and I learned a bunch.
Thanks, Doug. Julian?
I think the story I will tell, I mean, just starting back from when what I talked about off the jump was insufficient customer validation, right? I worked at a company where the board had basically authorized like, $10 million capital investment in software engineering for something that basically the only reason they got greenlit is on the CTO's word, right? He talked to 5 of his buddies, and all his buddies are like, "Oh, that's an awesome idea. You should totally go and build that." So when I inherit this thing as a product manager, I'm like, "Who'd you talk to? How do we know this thing's valuable, right? Can we put the brakes on this thing, right? It doesn't seem like we've done enough validation. Oh no, the board is already expecting all this, right? And they're expecting this NPV and stuff." I'm like, this is crazy, right? And I think in one of our pre-chats, Doug, like you were saying, one of the shops you've been working with in DC, maybe it was like National Science Foundation or something, right? Forcing entrepreneurs to talk to dozens of potential users and customers, maybe even like 100, right? And it's like that kind of scale that you maybe not right off the bat, right? But you should be thinking about like your friends and family are always going to tell you that your idea is great, right? But you really want the unvarnished population out there that's really going to tell you, no, actually, Julian, that idea sucks. You should maybe think about this instead, right? And that's how you avoid these very, very costly and expensive mistakes and products that flop in the market.
Thank you very much, Julian and Doug, for your time today. Not that I want to wrap up, but just looking, it's 1 o'clock now. Now we have a number of questions we didn't get a chance to touch on. And one of the questions was, how do we reach you guys? So maybe each of you could give the audience, if you want, a way to contact you if they have further questions, because these are fascinating topics.
I'll go ahead and send a direct message here to everybody, so you have my contact information.
Yeah, I just dropped my email in the chat. You can also look me up on LinkedIn as well and message me that way.
All right. And Laura, did you have any final words or things that you'd like to say?
No, I just want to say this has been fantastic. And I just want to thank you, Julian and Doug, and you too, Ernie, in terms of having just a super webinar, very educational, informational, and I so much. And again, if people have additional questions, always feel free to send them my way at laura@venturecatalyst.biz. And I'm happy also to get in touch with these guys and get a response. But again, thanks so much. And I hope everybody has a great rest of the afternoon.
Thanks, Laura.
All right.
Thanks,
Y'all
Laura.
take
Thanks,
care.
Ernie.
Thanks, Ernie.
Take care, everyone.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
everyone.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.